So much for the tangible. Thus far we've spent our time on the places in a text that can more or less be measured. They leave traces in the work that a reader can point to and say, there, that's a character narrator because of the viewpoint, or that character attacking his father's killer is acting out a revenge plot. Things like that. Of the categories we've discussed in these lessons, the plot, the narrator, the characters, the story world, and the text, well, all those story elements are evident in the book for anyone to see, more or less. The subtext, on the other hand, is not nearly as visible, but that doesn't mean it's not important. If I ask the question, what does Jane Eyre mean? I'd likely get a different response from every reader. Is it a story about love, loyalty, honesty, sex, marriage, friendship, all those things? If I reframe that question to where does the meaning in Jane Eyre lie, I'd get still more diverse answers. At the level of the word, sentence, chapter, or perhaps at the level of human psychology? Or would it be at the level of the individual reader's psychology? Surely Jane Eyre's meaning lies in all those places, and surely there's meaning that readers and literary scholars have yet to uncover. Jane Eyre in 2020 is likely to reveal things about the human story that Bronte's readership never could have foreseen in 1966, let alone 1866. I guess what I'm trying to say is that meaning is a very tricky thing to get hold of and teach in the way we've been trying to get hold of the more tangible elements of written fiction. I started out with the model of a painting class and the goal of making the abstract tools of fiction writing more concrete, to turn syntax and story structure into brushes, spatulas, and oil paints. Unfortunately, on this front, I'm going to fall a little short. Meaning is not a tangible skill, and no amount of study or drilling can predict what kind of meaning a reader will infer from your stories. This section will be slight in its scope for a couple reasons. The first we've just mentioned. There aren't a lot of hard skills between the lines. The second is that this territory isn't just well-trod, it's been positively trampled into oblivion. This is the domain of almost every English class you've ever taken. What does the green light mean to Gatsby? Or the doctor's eyes? Ooh, the eyes must be a statement about the evils of capitalism. Everybody nod now as if that's profound and we can pretend we're in a college literature seminar. Yes, very insightful, Roe. You must be a real deep thinker. Okay, I kid a little. Perhaps that's my personal bias showing through. I did learn a lot about literature from taking literature classes, but I'm sure you won't be too shocked to hear that I found them very frustrating at times. Apart from a pair of narrative theory courses and a linguistics class or two, I spent almost the entirety of my formal education in literature classes firmly in this sixth subtextual, intangible, nebulous, and largely inaccessible domain. You probably guessed that I feel far more comfortable with at least one foot on the solid earth. So why is every English class about all this intangible stuff then? That answer may go all the way back to our discussion of the Kims and Davids, the intuitive versus the empirical approach to literature. I'm sure you won't be too shocked to hear that most English teachers are intuitive people. Truth to many of my English professors seemed largely to be about what they could make a convincing rhetorical argument for, regardless of whether there was any actual real-world truth undergirding it. And then there's the issue of ideology, no small matter in the humanities these days, especially with literature. Almost all my English professors who taught literature sheerly because of their love of literature have now retired. The rest, by my reckoning, are all at least half an activist, meaning they care more about political ideology than literature, and the literature is merely the vehicle they use to advance their activism. And syntax and story structure aren't exactly sexy or useful ways to bolster a social or political cause. Lastly, the largest reason I suspect most English classes fail to stray very far from this sixth domain is that it's low-hanging fruit. Any old mediocrity can lead a discussion on the symbolism of the green light or the doctor's eyes. Learning syntax, linguistics, and narrative theory are all difficult tasks in their own right. Teaching them to a room full of sophomores in a literature class is even harder. It takes a special teacher to get a 19-year-old truly excited about the intricacies of literature, and most teachers are average, by definition. Roll all those reasons into a big ball and cement it with a healthy coating of postmodern cynicism, and you're likely to continue to get more of the same out of a formal literary education for the foreseeable future. If you're looking to learn about the beauty and nuance of literature, you probably won't find it at a university these days. Perhaps you never could. Thankfully, you'll always find beauty and nuance in the books themselves, though. Anyway, this ultimate section in these lessons is about the subtext. It's about the stuff we can only infer, which means things are about to get subjective. But don't despair. Again, I'm going to keep things focused on the task at hand. What tools can we use to learn here? We'll start by focusing on ways we can think about the subtext on the level of the page. Then we'll shift focus to deal with things like metaphor, theme, and meaning, from the small scale to the large. And the best thing about the subjective is that you can't be that wrong about anything here. As Dr. House is so fond of saying, quite rightly, none of this means anything anyway. So why do we find stories so meaningful then? Well, that's a question above Ro's pay grade. I'm still grappling with that damn green light. We're going to begin our discussion on subtext with subtext. There goes Ro again, stating the obvious. Well, it's worth mentioning that the word subtext can stand in for several things that have to do with the meaning between the lines in the story. It can refer to the larger subtext of the work, the real meaning behind the story. Those are larger questions than what we'll be starting with here. Sometimes subtext is smaller. That's what we'll be wrestling with today, a manageably sized opponent. American writers of literary fiction have an oversized love of this kind of subtext, in my opinion. Perhaps it's a legacy handed down from Hemingway. Perhaps it's just that leaving things half-spoken or even unspoken leaves the reader in the position of pondering the story more deeply. To me, it seems a bit like the epiphany in early to mid-20th century short stories. A literary story just didn't seem complete without one. But sometimes epiphanies don't happen, especially in real life. And, similarly, quite often, people talk to each other without talking past each other. Sometimes people are quite direct, and this too can be dramatic, deep, and meaningful. So what am I going on about? Here's a glossary definition of subtext from a popular fiction writing book. Quote, meaning that is implied rather than stated. All text has a subtext, the meaning that lies beneath the actual words, end quote. The idea that all text has a subtext, I'd say, is a bit hyperbolic. If we're talking about a narrator describing a scene and a narrator says something like, there was a sofa and 2 chairs in the living room, I think you can generally take it at face value. Now one might make the case that the fact that the character has a sofa and 2 chairs in her living room conveys information about her, like that she's got enough money for a sofa, 2 chairs, and a living room for that matter. Fair enough, I guess. But I'm not so certain that thinking that far between the lines does all that much good for a writer. You can send yourself into a tailspin pretty fast trying to get at the deeper meaning and the meaning behind that meaning, when you probably don't need to go much deeper than, she had a sofa and 2 chairs. Great, no big deal. Means she needs to sit down from time to time, and occasionally she might have guests over. Of course there's more information there that could be inferred, but is it serving us writers well, or is it getting in our way? So too with subtext when characters speak to one another. If Lily says to Derek, I love you so much, can't she just mean it? I love you so much. And can't that be dramatic in the context of a love story? I think some fiction writers, especially literary writers, would say no, that there always must be more bubbling beneath the surface, or there should be. I'm not so sure. I'm of the Freud school here. Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, and that's fine. What I think writers should do is get a sense for when people use subtext in conversation, why they use it, and how it can be dramatic. One way to think about subtext in a conversation is as the little lies we tell each other, because sometimes as social creatures, we need to be polite for many different reasons. Gretchen hates Liza because her husband Thomas had a fling with Liza when they were first dating 10 years ago. Now their daughters are in the same class at school. When they bump into each other at the school play, Gretchen's probably going to say something like, "Hi Liza, it's so nice to see you," and both she and Liza are going to know better. But Liza's still probably going to say, "Oh, thank you, you too, Gretchen, you look so great." And we do this because it's a lot better than hurling obscenities across the room while the kids are just trying to recite their lines in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory without vomiting on stage or passing out in front of 200 people. All the little lies we tell each other have social meaning. In this case, I care more about supporting my child's current endeavors than my old grudge with you, Liza. Fake smile. All people engage in psychological games and dishonest behavior to help make potentially uncomfortable social situations more bearable for themselves or others, even if it's just by biting their tongues occasionally. Steven Pinker explores this curious and understudied aspect of human behavior in his 2008 book, The Stuff of Thought, under the chapter heading Games People Play. He highlights how speaking indirectly can often lead to a higher likelihood of attaining a desired outcome in certain circumstances. One example he gives is of the classic line at the end of a date. Jalen says to Rika, "Do you want to come up for coffee?" Now, it's probably late in the night, and neither of them really wants coffee, and both of them probably know the other doesn't want coffee. Jalen's asking Rika if she wants to have sex with him, so why not just ask her directly? Pinker points out that couching the real question subtextually behind a more innocuous question is the smart move both statistically and socially. If Jalen says nothing at the end of this date, he's almost guaranteed to get no sex. If he says, "Would you like to come up and have sex with me, Rika?" she may say yes. But the directness of the question makes a yes less likely, and it also increases the chance of a negative rebuke. Coffee, on the other hand, Pinker points out, is much easier for Rika to agree to, and if she doesn't think it's a good idea, there's little chance of a harsh rebuke. She can say something like, "Oh, no thanks, it's been a nice night, Jalen, but if I have coffee now, I'll never get to sleep, but you should call me." And nobody's ego has been destroyed. Or she might just say, "All right." This is one reason we use subtext. Sometimes the direct approach isn't the best move. There are quite a few other reasons we wouldn't realistically be direct with each other. Most of these circumstances occur when the risk of being direct is greater than the payoff of being indirect or ignoring the truth. Some of these circumstances might be telling white lies to save another's feelings, compromising principles for social acceptance, ignoring the elephant in the room, failing to address what you know will hurt, testing an adversary's boundaries, insulting someone indirectly, hiding one's true motives, or outright deceit. All of these are realistic circumstances where a person might say one thing and mean another. Sometimes dialogues like these can be imbued with highly dramatic subtext of the type literary writers go crazy for. Let's explore a pair of examples where a subtext plays a major role in a dialogue. The first is from Rick Bass's short story Fires, where the narrator, Joe, a Montana woodsman, is falling in love with Glenda, a runner who has come up to his high-altitude area to train for the summer. Both Joe and Glenda are drawn to each other and would often talk to each other on a two-way radio late at night. "Have you seen the hedgehog?" she would ask, sleepily, but it would only be a radio that was in the dark house with me, not her real voice. "Did you see the hedgehog?" she'd want to know. And I'd wish she were staying with me. I'd wish she were with me at the moment. But it would be no good. Glenda was leaving in August or September at the latest. "No," I'd say, "no hedgehog today. Maybe it's gone away," I'd say. "How are the dogs?" she'd ask. "How are Homer and Ann?" "They're asleep." "Good night," she'd say. "Good night," I'd say. Joe and Glenda are engaging in the classic act of ignoring the elephant in the room here. They both desperately want the other to just make a move. And if you look at the dialogue itself, it's so mundane. How are the dogs? Well, they're asleep. Have you seen the hedgehog? But because the conversation is imbued with this other layer, the two potential lovers holding back, the mundane dialogue is wrought with suspense. Will he say something? Will she say something? Will they? Won't they? Part of the reason it comes across so clearly in the dialogue is that the circumstances are clearly conveyed by the narrator, He tells it straight. I'd wish she were staying with me. I'd wish she were with me at the moment, but it would be no good. Then, when the reader gets to the back and forth about the dogs, it's very clear they're not just talking about the dogs. This is the kind of dramatic tension that subtext can convey when it's realistically portrayed. Here's another classic example of subtext being employed to convey a deeper meaning. In Edgar Allan Poe's short story The Cask of Amontillado, the narrator, Montresor, is bent on revenge against his rival Fortunato for insults against the Montresor family name. Montresor meets him at the festival, and then this happens. "My dear Fortunato, you are luckily met. How remarkably well you are looking today. But I have received a pipe of what passes for Amontillado, and I have my doubts." "How?" said he. "Amontillado? A pipe? Impossible! And in the middle of the carnival!" "I have my doubts," I replied. "And I was silly enough to pay the full Amontillado price without consulting you in the matter. You were not to be found, and I was fearful of losing a bargain. Amontillado? I have my doubts. Amontillado! And I must satisfy them. Amontillado! As you are engaged, I am on my way to Lucrezi. If anyone has a critical turn, it is he. He will tell me. Lucrezi cannot tell Amontillado from sherry. And yet some fools will have it that his taste is a match for your own. Come, let us go." "Whither?" "To your vaults." "My friend, no, I will not impose upon your good nature. I perceive you have an engagement. Lucrezi!" "I have no engagement. Come." "My friend, no, it is not the engagement, but the severe cold with which I perceive you are afflicted. The vaults are insufferably damp. They are encrusted with nitre. Let us go, nevertheless. The cold is merely nothing. Amontillado! You have been imposed upon. And as for Lucrezi, he cannot distinguish sherry from Amontillado." The reader can infer from this encounter that Montresor is using Fortunato's ego against him. It's the kind of cagey malevolence that you might see in Shakespeare. There are fools out there who think Lucrezi is as good as you, my friend. But you are so busy, so... Montresor knows Fortunato's ego won't let this kind of prick to it stand. And off to the catacombs they go. And Fortunato thinks it's his idea. Again, the subtext is clear to the reader here. I suspect this is a point that is often overlooked when discussing subtext. The reader understands how to read Montresor's dialogue because he states so clearly at the outset that he's bent on revenge. He really wants to get this guy. The story opens like this. "The 1,000 injuries of Fortunato I had borne as best I could, but when he ventured upon insult, I vowed revenge." Thus, when he meets Fortunato in the street, the reader knows that when he treats Fortunato with feigned good spirits, he's clearly being deceptive. The reader knows to look for some ill intent, though they may not know what Montresor's exact intentions are. They're clearly not good, though, and that makes the subtext all the more apparent from the outset. So, what can we conclude about subtext based on this brief discussion? A few things, I think. The first is that we shouldn't take the idea that there's a subtext to everything literally. Of course, there will always be more information underlying every situation than can make it onto the page. This is a product of both the complexity of life and the limitation of a symbolic art form. The sign will always be less complex than the signifier, and not every conversation has a deeper underlying meaning to be decoded. Nor is a conversation that has a clear subtext necessarily any more profound than one that lacks any interpretable subtext. But people play games, and sometimes this can be a wonderful chance to build drama. Subtext is often a very effective tool in the fiction writer's arsenal, yet the subtext should be clear to the reader so they stand a chance of interpreting the situation correctly. If Montresor doesn't signal his intention for revenge, or Joe doesn't make it clear that he deeply wishes to be with Glenda, then the reader reads Montresor's overture as a friendly, flattering encounter, and Joe and Glenda's radio conversation is just a totally boring, meaningless bit of small talk about dogs and hedgehogs. When characters speak past their true intentions, the reader should know it, and at least be able to guess why. Just like in real life, though, every fictional conversation can't have deeper layers to it. So when can writers realistically lay on the subtext and generate real tension in the process? It should fit the reality of both the character's motivation and the plot situation. This could happen in any time a reasonable person would withhold information or couch their true intentions behind a front to a purpose. It might be the type of game that Steven Pinker explains as a feature of human behavior, to increase the chances of a character getting what they want while decreasing the chances of a terrible outcome. It could also be outright deceit, like Montresor, or it could be a character being too vulnerable or emotionally distant to open up and risk getting hurt, like Joe. In any case, it's worth thinking about subtext in a dialogue as a tool, to be used to a purpose and with discretion. This means that overemphasizing the importance of subtext in fiction can lead to bad writing. A writer could easily steer their reader down the wrong path by trying to manufacture tension in an otherwise mundane interaction, which a reader would probably just read as being totally boring or confusing. Forcing subtext on a situation is not a good move when the actual dialogue will suffer as a result. And in those times when characters are talking and they'd realistically be direct, let them be direct. Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. Reading is hard enough. We can't realistically expect the reader to be excavating layer upon layer of inscrutable meaning ad infinitum. Not if we want them to stick around long enough to even consider the story meaningful. Tell a good story well, and the rest will take care of itself. Conversation has rules. We all know this intuitively, even if we haven't studied the psychology of group dynamics and discourse. And all but the most socially challenged of us intuitively know what the rules are, because we act them out every time we enter a conversation, whether it be with 1, 2, or 10 people in a group. The rules of discourse are a bit like punctuation in writing or a referee in sports. When everyone is following the rules and doing their job, no one notices the rules are there. But we know when someone messes up, interrupting others, dominating the conversation, speaking out of turn. All of these are examples of conversational miscues. It's much more apparent at those moments that far more than verbal information is being exchanged in a conversation. And understanding the rules of conversation, and the breaching of them, can help us writers to craft dialogue that characterizes our speakers as polite, arrogant, aggressive, passive, etc. Think of this brief lesson as a lesson in meta-conversation, the things that don't get said that say a lot. So let's get to the rules. Narrative theorist David Herman outlines 3 major rules for conversation based on a large body of research in the field of sociolinguistics. These rules cover social behavior that exists in parallel with the information conveyed by the conversations themselves. And the rules are things like who speaks, for how long, about what, and then who speaks next, and so on. In a fictional dialogue, readers will pick up on these social cues implicitly if they're not directly written into the text, and explicitly when they are. The rules are simple and you know them already. Let's examine them one by one. Adjacency pairs. If we think of a conversation a bit like a game, ping pong might be an apt analogy. One person begins a conversation by making a statement or asking a question. This begins the game. Everything that follows is a response to the initial statement, which is returned in kind. If you approached me on the street and said, "Some fine day we're having, Ro," you'd think it was a bit odd if I responded with something like, "The insular caribou have stopped breeding altogether." You'd think, "Damn, that was random. What the hell's up with Ro?" Because conversation is like a game of ping pong. Serve yields return, which yields volley, and so forth until the point is over. You say something about the weather and expect something somewhat related to the weather in return. This signals that we're playing the same game. Anything else is a deviation from the socially expected norm. That's rule 1. Incidentally, this is one of the reasons why expository dialogue can seem so off-putting to some readers. the content of the conversation doesn't seem to be an organic back and forth between two participants playing the same game. Instead, it seems like the author is putting words in the mouths of the players to feed information to the reader. Turn-taking. If we continue with our analogy, you might think of the first serve of the ping-pong ball as an invitation to return the ball. It's very similar with an overture in a conversation. "That shirt looks great on you, Chris. Where'd you get it?" is an invitation for Chris to say something like, "Thanks, Ro, I got it at JCPenney, half price, can you believe it?" And, depending on the context, I'd continue the conversation by offering a related comment or question until the conversation petered out. But did you notice that each of these statements ended with a question? Those are specific cues inviting the other speaker to take a turn in the conversation. Herman points out that the speaking role in a conversation is a shared commodity. How participants share this commodity reflects on the social standing of the conversation's participants. At some point during the conversation, participants are invited to take the floor and speak for a time, while others are expected to foster the conversation by listening and then responding appropriately when their turn to take the floor comes. Failure to adhere to these conventions may reflect negatively on the perception of an individual's sociability. For example, a conversation hog or a persistent interrupter might be viewed negatively by the participants who fail to get a word in edgewise or are continuously interrupted. However, a speaker who holds the floor and commands the attention of all the participants by paying off their patience with interesting stories or funny anecdotes may very well raise their esteem despite monopolizing the discourse. The important feature of turn-taking and floor-taking is that speaking time is a shared commodity, and the participants in a conversation will judge each other based on how they share that commodity. Topic shifts. Lastly, Herman highlights the collective consent of the group in deciding which topics to discuss. Like turn-taking, the topic of a conversation is a group effort. Participants tacitly agree to discuss a topic, and when this topic shifts, the participants must tacitly agree to shift topics. Participants in a conversation may find it annoying if another person insists on discussing a topic the other participants would prefer to avoid, or they may resent an attempt to change topics when the other participants are still enjoying the current topic. You might picture a group of friends happily discussing the wedding of a colleague when one member of a group attempts to shift the topic to politics against everyone else's wishes. This is unlikely to go over well. These rules, of course, are not quite that simple. In real life, these rules are destined to shift their already fuzzy boundaries depending on the size of the group engaged in the conversation, as well as the participants in it. A charismatic wealthy couple who charm everyone they meet at a Tony charity function may create resentment if they attempted to behave the same way at a family dinner or a church social. All these conventions are highly context dependent. They are, however, useful tools to help the fiction writer convey unspoken social information that gets exchanged between characters in some dialogues. We'll look at a couple examples to show how these rules of conversation can play out on the page. The first one you might remember from our lessons on dialogue. "You want to come for a ride?" he said. Connie smirked and let her hair fall loose over one shoulder. "Don't you like my car? New paint job," he said. "Hey." "What?" "You're cute." She pretended to fidget, chasing flies away from the door. "Don't you believe me or what?" he said. "Look, I don't even know who you are," Connie said in disgust. This first example from Joyce Carol Oates involves a conversation of two participants, one aggressively seeking the other's participation, and the other looking for a way out. The man begins the conversation by asking a direct question. It's an opening that invites a response from Connie, and by neglecting to take the floor, she's sending a clear message. "No, I don't want to come for a ride. I don't even want to be talking to you." The man responds to her social slight by pressing the point, highlighting his status and by pointing out that he has a car and that it's a nice car too. And sensing this is going nowhere, he decides to shift the topic, directly signaling his interest in her by calling her cute. This shift is even less welcome. Again, she ignores the invitation to take a turn in the conversation, focusing on the flies rather than on him or his interest with her. When he presses the issue again, she responds with a firm rebuke. "I don't even know who you are." More information gets exchanged here in reading the metatextual cues of this conversation. She's uncomfortable, fidgeting, refusing to answer or participate in the conversation. He's pressing her for attention. The words getting passed between these two convey far less information than the character's behavior surrounding the words. This is where an implicit understanding of the rules of conversation helps your reader to read the situation as the author intends, as an unwanted and uncomfortable overture by a creepy guy. Let's consider an entirely different type of conversation. This comes from the opening pages of Susan Peribo's short story, Some Say the World. The three participants in this conversation are a middle-aged mother, her 18-year-old pyromaniac daughter, who is also the character narrator, and the stepfather, Mr. Arnett, to whom the mother is being unfaithful. Mom has been pretending to take a poetry class at a community college as a ruse to see her lover. Watch how what's not being said overshadows the actual words exchanged. When she comes in the door a little after 9, she sets her clearly untouched poetry book on the end table next to where I am on the couch. "How was it?" Mr. Arnett asks, smacking his gum and not looking up from the board. "Oh my mother said. You wouldn't believe the things those people wrote then." "Who'd you do tonight?" I ask her. It is a game that I've worked up. Sometimes I suspect that Mr. Arnett is playing it as well, but other times I think he's just being duped by her. "What's that?" my mother asks, separating the lashes over one eye, which could have been caked with sweat-soaked mascara. "Who'd you do tonight?" I put a cigarette in my mouth, wait for one of them to light it. "Oh, Browning," my mother says. "Which one?" Mr. Arnett asks. He looks up at me, not her, then takes the lighter from his shirt pocket and snaps on the flame in front of my face, so close I could reach out and swallow it. "Which one?" she asks. "Which Browning?" Mr. Arnett says. The lighter disappears back into his shirt. My mother misses a beat and then says, "All of them." She hovers over the parcheesi board, feigning interest in the game, and her mink stole knocks one of my pieces to the floor. Mr. Arnett makes a disgusted sigh, although it was him, I know, who bought her the thing. She pats my head. "About your bedtime," she says, as if I am 12 and have to get up early to catch the school bus, not 18 and drugged beyond understanding anything much more difficult than parcheesi and knowing that my mother, at 40, is sneaking around in motel rooms. It's clear from the way the mother behaves that there's something off here. The stepfather and the daughter are both adhering to the normal rules of discourse, while the mother isn't quite playing along. She clearly has something else on her mind, and she's not a particularly good liar either. The daughter challenges her mother by asking specifically which poet they talked about in her class. "Who'd you do tonight?" with a little double entendre thrown in for good measure. And the mother pretends to be distracted. "What's that?" The daughter could easily let her off the hook with a typically teenage eye roll and a never mind, but she doesn't. She repeats, "Who'd you do tonight?" And you can see how the daughter and stepfather are insisting upon adhering to the normal rules of discourse. They won't allow her to shift topics. "Which one?" Mr. Arnett asks her twice. And after she misses a beat, she's forced to respond with a poorly considered lie. "All of them," exposing the obvious. Neither the daughter nor the stepfather is inclined to let her shift the topic or avoid a turn, even though she'd very much like to. Then, after that obviously ridiculous response, the mother absent-mindedly knocks over the game piece, which a reader could realistically interpret as an act of protest, as if to say, "Let it go, you guys," before saying directly to the daughter, "About your bedtime." This entire conversation could fall neatly under the elephant in the room type of subtext, but it isn't just what's not being said. Much of what is being avoided is revealed through the daughter and stepfather using the conventional rules of conversation to poke at the mother's obvious deception. It isn't merely subtext here, but a metatextual battle on the three participants' behavior. The daughter deliberately takes the floor so that she can put her mother on the floor to answer direct questions she won't have answers to. It's also fitting that the daughter and Mr. Arnett are together, playing their own game, and Mr. Arnett plays along with the daughter's second game, but only to a point. He's not willing to say, "We both know you don't know anything about either of the Brownings, dear. Where were you tonight?" When characters breach or attempt to breach the rules of conversation, that means something. Even beyond what lies between the lines in a dialogue, readers can make inferences about characters by how those characters behave in response to the rules of discourse. This is yet another element of a story's subtext that can bear important information that never directly makes it to the page. What does it say about a character when they won't answer a direct question, or shift the topic rather suddenly, or take the floor only to put another character on the spot? All of these metatextual cues are going to say something to your reader, even if you can't point to a single word in the text that proves it. Subtext is the realm of inferences, where a good portion of the fiction lies. Yet another component in the subtextual arsenal of the fiction writer is the metaphor. Metaphors convey more information than what literally appears on the page through analogy. But why are they so prevalent in fiction? Why do fiction writers so consistently apply this tool? Perhaps the answer to those questions can be had by first understanding how metaphors work. What exactly do metaphors do cognitively? For that answer, we're going to need a little help from our friends, the cognitive linguists. But first, let's get a general sense for what metaphors are. Metaphors, according to most definitions, are pithy comparisons that talk about one thing as if it were another. This allows the writer to convey a sense of familiarity to a situation that may be totally new to the reader. Or, metaphors may convey a quicker sense of clarity than a straight description of the situation would. This is the utility of the metaphor. Essentially, they're cognitive shortcuts, allowing a person to learn something new by using old, well-understood ideas, concepts, or imagery. This is one of the reasons people use metaphors so incessantly. And you might be thinking, well, I'm not so sure I use metaphors all that often, Ro. I can't even remember the last time I busted out a good old-fashioned metaphor. Well, you'd be wrong if you were thinking that. We use metaphors so constantly that most of them don't even register as being metaphors to us. I am wiped out. There's one. Elvira's flowing black hair hypnotized the young men at the party. There's two. The pressure of working the phones at the Cancer Fund's annual membership drive left Andre totally drained. There's three. Most of these metaphors you probably need to go looking for to even realize the metaphorical nature of these common expressions. We have hundreds of words in English that derive their meaning metaphorically. Politics, for instance, takes its meaning from the ancient Greek word for city, polis, representing the civic duties that go along with managing the day-to-day decisions that face a city-state. Metaphors are everywhere. The reason we don't recognize most metaphors is that they've become so familiar we don't need to remember the association anymore. Essentially, the unfamiliar has become just as familiar as the original referent. Cognitive linguists call these dead metaphors. Most metaphors, writes Steven Pinker, are dead metaphors, like coming to a head, which people would probably stop using if they knew that it alludes to the buildup of pus in a pimple. Before they go to die, though, often these future dead metaphors manifest themselves as clichés, which many writing instructors instruct writers to avoid using at all cost. I'm going to use a few here, though, because I have a window of opportunity to scrape the bottom of the barrel, merely touching the tip of the iceberg of dead horses I can beat to death by using the free pass I have to use as many clichés in one sentence as a single writer would ever dare to dream. Dear, oh dear. I think a healthy part of the wisdom undergirding the avoidance of clichés is that the analogy ceases to convey its idea with the kind of surprise that a novel and apt metaphor often does. This is a convention too, though, and clichés only become clichés by dint of their utility in conveying a common idea. Certainly you wouldn't want your writing littered with them, but I'm not so certain we need to root out every last one and salt the earth for good measure, as long as we're self-aware. So, metaphors, whether they come in dead, cliché, or novel form, must be useful if they're so prolific in our speech. And they certainly are both prolific and useful. One might think of metaphors as a kind of linguistic bootstrapping tool. Bootstrapping, itself a metaphor, is a process whereby a system self-improves without external input. One concept allows for the development of the next, and so forth. Metaphors serve as linguistic bootstrapping by allowing us to linguistically express a vast array of phenomena using information that we already know. Pinker gives the example of a kettle boiling over to describe diverse situations that are similar in some way, like the feud between Jody and Todd, the result of mixing vinegar and baking soda, or the rising waters above a dam, all things that are literally unrelated. This versatility helps us to explain new phenomena easily, especially with newcomers totally out of their element. According to Pinker, metaphors can be most useful with difficult ideas. Children may not understand politics or intellectual argumentation, but they surely understand rubber bands and fistfights, which, when cleverly analogized, stand in quite well for the rough-and-tumble worlds of politics and intellectual debate. Now, all this might be well and good, but it doesn't go very far in explaining the phenomenon of the metaphor as it commonly presents in the literary sense. And fortunately for us, Pinker has evaluated this too. According to Pinker, literary metaphors need to do two things to work well. First, the metaphor must make a clear and useful link between its source, the already well-known information, and its target, the novel situation being described. Second, it should accurately convey an emotional coloring from the source to the target. Pinker gives the example of former British Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli's famous quote, "I have climbed to the top of the greasy pole." The source in this case is the image of climbing to the top of a greased pole, and the target is the world of British politics. This metaphor succeeds by making a clear link between the difficulty of climbing up a greased pole and the difficulty of rising to the top of the parliamentary pecking order. Great start! But this metaphor is only successful on both fronts because the greasy imagery carries with it an emotional coloring that fits politics well. It's dirty, slimy, hard to wipe off, and largely unpleasant. Ideally, literary metaphors should perform both functions equally well. Part of knowing how metaphors can be done right is knowing how they can go wrong. Pinker offers a few guidelines here as well. There are essentially three ways a metaphor can go off the rails, sometimes comically so, as evidenced by Pinker's examples. The first metaphor mistake is a source that adds no useful information about its target. Essentially, the example doesn't help the reader to understand the situation any further than what they already know from straight description. Pinker offers the following two examples. John and Mary had never met. They were like two hummingbirds who had also never met. And the thunder was ominous sounding, much like the sound of a thin sheet of metal being shaken backstage during the storm scene in a play. These examples both seem silly, precisely because they convey nothing except the cluelessness of the writer. Few badly formed metaphors are going to be this comically obvious. The point here is to make certain that if you add a metaphor, it's actually adding something to the reader's understanding of the new situation. Second metaphor faux pas is when the writer needs to work so hard to explain the connection that it defeats the purpose of the metaphor's addition in the first place. Here's Pinker's example. He spoke with the wisdom that can only come from experience, like a guy who went blind because he looked at a solar eclipse without one of those boxes with a pinhole in it, and now goes around the country speaking at high schools about the dangers of looking at solar eclipses without one of those boxes with a pinhole in it. Again, an extreme example to get the point across. Metaphors should be quick, sharp, and pithy. If it takes longer than the description would, it's probably ill-founded. Lastly, the most egregious of metaphor mistakes comes about when the emotional coloring of the source clashes so badly with the target that atrocities like this happen. The ballerina rose gracefully on point and extended one slender leg behind her, like a dog at a fire hydrant. Or, my personal favorite, McBride fell 12 stories, hitting the pavement like a hefty bag filled with vegetable soup. Pinker's comical examples show what can happen when the emotional coloring is really off. And yeah, you don't really want to do this. The truth is, if you're inclined to do any of these things so egregiously with any degree of regularity, Neither I, nor anyone else, nor any set of lessons or guidelines can really help you. But if you're like most writers who spin the occasional metaphor into her tale, without feeling 100% that it's ringing true, think about the two things a metaphor should do: add a clear analogical association and an emotional coloring. And if you don't think those two things are happening with any degree of confidence, why force the issue? I've mentioned Pinker's do nots here because I think they're quite useful benchmarks to measure your metaphors against. But I'd be remiss if I didn't include at least a couple cases where I think metaphors work really well and sharpen or beautify a piece of fiction. The first case I think is excellent for its brevity. Technically, the following examples are hyphenated similes, but let's not get too persnickety. We're talking about the cases that fall under the giant patio-sized umbrella of all things metaphorical. And there's a lot of different types of metaphors under this umbrella, usually with ridiculous and complex names like synecdoche or metonymy or something of the sort. I'm sure there must be a linguistic or literary term specific to this first type of metaphor, but I've never come across it, so I simply call this the hyphen-like metaphor. They go like this. Boo, at 5, ran around the field with unbridled joy, kitten-like, hopping after the butterflies with surprising dexterity. Or, Vera lay prone on the grass, posing, sphinx-like, musing on the beauty of some distant place. Now, neither of these are particularly beautiful or evocative, and they're certainly not overly original. But you might think of the hyphen-like metaphor as the fast-acting formula. It gets the job done quickly without much ado, and they're much easier to apply than the whole Megillah. The other type of metaphor that I appreciate is one that conveys a visual image. I'm sure you won't be shocked when I offer you two examples from Melville. His writing is overflowing with metaphors, and they aren't all winners. Frankly, a great many of them require footnotes to understand, because the reference that might have been obvious to any literate reader in the 1850s have become more than a little obscure with the passage of time. But such a vast array of metaphors of different types leaves clues as to which metaphors will truly endure, and inevitably I find myself most enamored with the simplicity of a visual image that just can't be missed. Here's a brief one to start. The ship tore on, leaving such a furrow in the sea as when a cannonball missent becomes a plowshare and turns up the level field. This metaphor hits on both Pinker's requirements. It adds useful analogous information about the target by describing the source, and that source, the cannonball, conveys the emotional coloring of the ship tearing through the waves with the alacrity of a cannonball. It's simple, functional, and presents an image of a ship so bent on the whale chase that it leaves a proper hole in the waves behind it. The longer one here I love for the same reasons, but in true Melville fashion, he stretches this one out, decorating the image in such lyrical prose as only he can. This is toward the end of the book when Ishmael's companion, Queequeg, catches an illness that leaves him in the following state on his deathbed. But, as all else in him thinned, and his cheekbones grew sharper, his eyes, nevertheless, seem growing fuller and fuller. They became of a strange softness of luster, and mildly but deeply looked out at you there from his sickness, a wondrous testimony to that immortal health in him, which could not die, or be weakened, and, like circles on the water, which, as they grow fainter, expand, so his eyes seemed rounding and rounding like the rings of eternity. I love this image, partly because it's visual, and partly because of its simple beauty, and let's face it, so his eyes seem rounding and rounding like the rings of eternity. The guy was just damn good. You can't teach that, but you can learn from it. So start with the ground rules we've discussed here, and head on out to the wide world of fiction with your eyes trained to pick out your favorite metaphors. Take notes as to how the target is described by the source. See if you can discern the way the emotional coloring of the source paints the target with its meaning. Like any other aspect of fiction writing, metaphors can be cleverly crafted and add descriptive beauty and force to your writing. Or they could fall flat, like a hefty bag filled with vegetable soup. Making sure they don't fall flat may take patience, but let's not mistake the ornaments with the tree here. Metaphors can be beautiful decorations to add flair to your writing, but the story is the tree in this barely passable Christmas tree metaphor. Don't despair if metaphors aren't your bag. There's always the other 99.9% of the story to make up for that. So, here we are at the end. The big question. What does all this mean? And damned if I know. That's the great human mystery, elusive to every artist, philosopher, and shaman ever to try to make sense of this crazy world. Fiction operates in these grounds, as I told you from the outset. Remember? Explores the nature of the human condition? Well, that's necessarily deep stuff if you're going there. And you don't have to go there. You might also remember that my definition of good fiction made room for entertains as well. Which means if you want to write steamy romance novels that sell well because they enrich a bunch of lives with the titillation your readers aren't getting in their day-to-day, amen. Good on you. Same for all the aspiring James Pattersons whose readers are out there now, fantasizing about single-handedly taking down a terrorist cell while they punch a clock at their accounting firms or IT service desks. Those books are no less good than the artsy ones, and they may do far more good than we know by filling gaps that most people's mundane reality cannot fill, or is not filling at the moment. Most of us wouldn't last very long in a 24/7 bare-knuckle adventure or a never-ending non-stop sex romp. I suspect this is one of the major functions of fiction, to keep us busy and ready in our downtime, and perhaps even prepare us for those rare times when things do get crazy on us, and they will. What to make of the deeper parts of this fiction stuff is essentially the question we're wrestling with in this lesson. This is the type of stuff that can send even the greatest philosophers into a tailspin, and if there's anything less productive than a tailspin for a fiction writer, I don't know what it is. Pondering the depths of the metaphysics of fiction isn't going to help you to be a better writer. Becoming a better writer is. But if you're one of those people who needs an overarching narrative that explains why you do what you do, I'll give you a quick rundown of what I've learned on this front. We write and read about what matters to us as humans, and books that don't hit on stuff that matters quickly get weeded out of the marketplace. The enduring classics from all cultures are filled with information about the deep and abiding questions of human nature. Ideologically minded scholars and critics tend to be highly critical of the very idea of human universals, intent instead on pointing their focus at the cultural differences that make groups of people distinct. Fair enough, there are good reasons to do this, but to do it to the exclusion of the reality that humans share far more in common than the idiosyncrasies that separate us seems both counterfactual and counterproductive to me. Post-colonial scholar Patrick Colm Hogan addresses this scholarly proclivity to avoid discussing universals in a manner I think captures the essence of what makes stories such an effective cross-cultural vehicle. He writes, "Literature, or more properly, verbal art, is not produced by nations, periods, and so on. It is produced by people, and these people are incomparably more alike than not. They share ideas, perceptions, desires, aspirations, and emotions. And the evidence produced by those who have begun to study literature from a more scientific perspective tends to follow a similar trajectory, according to evolutionary psychologist Robin Dunbar, who writes, although attempts to explore the nature of drama in literature from an evolutionary perspective are still very much in their infancy, those that have been undertaken agree that the great themes of literature are invariably also the great themes of life: mate choice, parenting, survival, group cohesion, and the hero triumphing in the face of adversity." Steven Pinker tackles the same question from a cognitive standpoint in his book How the Mind Works, offering a good reason why fictional stories are a human universal. When the fictional illusions work, there is no mystery as to the question, why do people enjoy fiction? It is identical to the question, why do people enjoy life? When we are absorbed in a book or movie, we get to see breathtaking landscapes, hobnob with important people, fall in love with ravishing men and women, protect loved ones, attain impossible goals, and defeat wicked enemies. And the better a job a piece of fiction does at helping us to simulate these engaging experiences, the more people enjoy it and buy it. The prestige, wealth, and influence that goes with creating a culturally significant story has been a part of the storytelling process since the only stories told were told around campfires. Let's face it, storytellers aren't just out to explore human existence and enrich the lives of others, although that's a nice goal to which many storytellers aspire. But for just as many, it's about elevating themselves in the eyes of their peers. If an author says that they're not after the fame and prestige that goes along with writing a bestseller or a critically acclaimed book, let's be kind and say that they're at least being partly disingenuous, and grant that they may care about the art more. But homegirl's still gotta eat, and her studio in Brooklyn ain't cheap. And why choose to live in Brooklyn instead of, say, a single wide in Salina, Kansas? Let's at least be honest with ourselves about what we're doing if we're gonna do it. But why should creating fiction elevate one in prestige and pay? Simple. It's for the same reason Pinker notes above. People enjoy it and are willing to pay for the privilege. And transcendent fiction is rare. So if or when one does write something great, they deserve the spoils that go with it. Whatever fiction does mean, though, it's probably impossible to qualify either in individual cases or generally. But we can say that fiction means something to almost everyone. It is meaningful. It keeps us entertained and exploring our existence, especially in the facets of our lives we don't fully comprehend and cannot clearly articulate. We can say this much about its meaning at least, and we'll say a bit more as this lesson progresses. But for now, let's take a closer look at a couple of the tools that exist in the realm of meaning. Because if this series of lessons is about anything, it's about building tools for writers to use in their meaningful fiction. The first meaning tool worth mentioning is the symbol. Symbols pop up constantly in literary stories. Put simply, symbols are images or objects that carry meaning beyond their literal role in the story. In the short story Man and Wife by Katie Chase, the character narrator, a young schoolgirl, lives in a strange but somewhat familiar story world where everything seems like contemporary America, complete with bicycles, barbecues, and Barbie playhouses. Yet the girls are married off in middle school to be housewives in arranged marriages. In the story, the Barbies keep appearing again and again as the protagonist tries to cling to her childhood while being simultaneously forced to grow up far too fast. The Barbies are symbolic, a small piece of the girl's childhood innocence, and by the end of the story, the narrator has outgrown them. They're dolls, yes, but they're not just dolls. They carry more meaning than a simple plastic object for a child to play with. They stand in for the significance that play holds for a developing child, and even for how the specific ways children play conveys cultural information about their society. The second meaning tool worth mentioning in this context is the epiphany. I've mentioned the epiphany briefly before in the context of plot. I'm going to stick with the framework I used then because it works well to get at the heart of a seemingly slippery and abstract concept. An epiphany is an event or realization that causes the character to question a significant chunk of their knowledge world. Some of this may transfer to the reader as well. It's as though the world opens a new window for the character, and through this window there's a reality that either significantly widens or contradicts the knowledge base that character was operating with prior to this revelation. Perhaps the most often cited example is James Joyce's short story Araby. But you'll also find epiphanies in just about every Flannery O'Connor short story, all of which are worth a read. Usually a character has a limited, idealistic or unrealistic view of reality that gets smashed to pieces by the harder real-world aspects of the story world. In the case of Araby, the narrator, a young boy, has built up an unrealistic expectation of the Araby Bazaar, and he promises to go and bring back a souvenir for a girl he has a crush on, whom he also idealizes in an unrealistic way. When he makes it to the bazaar, he finds the place superficial, drab, and ugly, dashing his hopes in a way that shakes his knowledge world, prompting a re-evaluation of his entire outlook. Is that crush of his really as wonderful as he's built her up to be as well? Epiphanies are usually something like this. The last of the meaning tools we'll discuss here is essentially the meaning itself, which is usually expressed in literary terms as a work's theme. Symbols and epiphanies often stack up cumulatively to generate a story's theme. But this isn't algebra. Meaning is a messy business, and you're not likely to get too much agreement on a story's theme from a diverse group of readers, even if we were to concede that most stories even have a theme as such. Most stories carry multiple thematic elements, and what those themes are is largely open to interpretation. But themes often serve as metaphorical or allegorical representations of human life or society, which the reader then brings back with them to their own lives. In this way, themes become their own large-scale metaphorical elements, where the story world acts as the source and the reader's life is the target, expanding the reader's understanding of their own world through the story's events and emotional coloring. It's something like that. So let's take a crack at figuring out how these three meaning-making elements might work in a story. And since I've made such a fuss about Moby Dick over the course of these lessons, it'll make a fitting conclusion here. Melville's epic is certainly rich territory on all three counts. Let's start with the symbol. You know, the big one, the size of which Melville didn't hesitate to exaggerate, even beyond its massive real-world size. How then, with me writing of this Leviathan, unconsciously my chirography expands to placard capitals. Give me a condor's quill. Give me Vesuvius's crater for an inkstand. Friends, hold my arms. For in the mere act of penning my thoughts of this Leviathan, they weary me, and make me faint with their overreaching comprehensiveness of sweep, as if to include the whole circle of the sciences, and all the generation of whales and men and mastodons, past, present, and to come, with all the revolving panoramas of empire on earth, and throughout the whole universe, not excluding its suburbs. Yes, friends, the whale. And the whale looms so large over the story, the first chapter is literally titled Loomings. So, what does the whale symbolize, you may ask? And the answer may depend on whom you ask, but since I'm the one talking, and I favor explications on literature that demonstrate literature's universal appeals, and great literature's appeal to those universals, I say the whale symbolizes the threatening side of nature. For there is no more universal struggle than ours against nature. Survival wasn't just a question to be dealt with for our ancestors, it was the question. This is easy to forget in an era of supermarkets, emergency rooms, and antibiotics. Contending with nature was a dangerous prospect, and one that for many people couldn't be avoided. The natural world needed to be reckoned with, and surely as it feeds us generously one day, it will greedily gobble us up. Part of the acquired wisdom of our ancestors' struggle with nature was the reality that the natural world bites back when you challenge it. And let's face it, the arrogance of a 5'10" land-dwelling mammal setting to the sea to hunt the ocean's most massive creatures, armed with only skiffs, harpoons, and ropes, well, that's one bold and hubristic undertaking to say the least. Ahab fought the whale and got his leg bit off for his trouble. To a stable, well-adjusted person with an understanding of his place in the universe, this is the cost of doing business in those waters, high though it may be. Ahab was having none of it, though. He vowed vengeance on nature itself by swearing to hunt the legendary whale that took off his leg, unmasted him in Ahab's own word, till one of them was dead. Ahab's unwillingness to accept the fundamental structure of reality, essentially his smallness and mortality in the face of nature's vastness and indifference, well, this spirit seemed to possess and haunt the ship's entire journey, leaving his officers and even the lowliest crew members questioning Ahab's sanity. Ahab often shared his crew's doubts about him. When Ahab speaks, it's usually in quick, sharp sentences that get crewmen leaping out of his way or into a task. But several times throughout the story, Ahab is prompted to a long soliloquy by some event, object, or, in this final case, a question from his first mate, Starbuck. And Ahab's reflections serve as epiphanic in my book, even if they aren't quite as clear-cut an epiphany as Joyce's Araby. Here's how Ahab reacts when Starbuck asks him to reject his compulsion to hunt Moby Dick and to turn back home the night before the final showdown. What is it? What nameless, inscrutable, unearthly thing is it? What cozening hidden lord and master and cruel remorseless emperor commands me, that against all natural lovings and longings I so keep pushing and crowding and jamming myself on all the time, recklessly making me ready to do what in my own proper natural heart I durst not so much as dare? Is Ahab Ahab? Is it I, God, or who, that lifts this arm? But if the great sun move not of himself, but is as an errand boy in heaven, nor one single star can revolve but by some invisible power, how then can this one small heart beat, this one small brain think thoughts, unless God does that beating, does that thinking, does that living, and not I? By heaven, man, we are turned round and round in this world, like yonder windlass, and fate is the handspike. And all the time, lo, that smiling sky, and this unsounded sea. Look, see on albacore. Who put it in him to chase and fang that flying fish? Where do murderers go, man? Who's to doom when the judge himself is dragged to the bar? But it is a mild, mild wind, and a mild-looking sky, and the air smells now, as if it blew from a faraway meadow. They have been making hay somewhere under the slopes of the Andes, Starbuck, and the mowers are sleeping among the new-mown hay. Sleeping, aye, toil how we may, we all sleep at last on the field. This is certainly meaning writ large. A psychologist might make the case that this is simply Ahab justifying actions he knows to be foolish by passing the buck to God instead. Hey, God made me as such, don't blame me, Starbuck, blame him. But this speech by Ahab seems far too sincere to be that cynical. There's pathos in it. Ahab is feeling this sentiment deeply, sincerely questioning why he can't simply forget the futile chase. He seems to legitimately mirror the albacore, almost helplessly compelled to chase and fang after Moby Dick, even if it means his ruin. And surely this epiphany echoes real life in so many ways. Who doesn't know someone who can't stop chasing something they're absolutely consumed by, even if it destroys them? Cigarettes, an abusive ex, drugs, gambling, work, political ambition. So many people end up getting destroyed by their greatest desires, even in the face of their certain comprehension of how the story ends. They do it anyway, as Ahab does, with just as much of a heavy heart as Starbuck, whose impassioned pleading falls on Ahab's deaf, longing ears. So after all this, what does Moby Dick mean? Which is to say, what is its theme? To me, this isn't a story of man against nature, so much as it is a story of men against nature. I'm going to make what may be a controversial assertion by saying that the reason this book still resonates is that the whale isn't really all that important. In fact, the whale isn't even the most important symbol in the book. There's something far more meaningful here, even than the eternal theme of a hunt against a dangerous foe. If you blink during chapter 36, you might even miss it, with all the activity, shouts, toasts, cheering, and aggrandizing speeches Ahab gives. But this is the moment, the setting of the real terms of their voyage. Ahab gathers all the men at the quarterdeck and asks every one of them to vow with him to hunt Moby Dick to the ends of the earth. And as a reward, he presents a Spanish doubloon for the man who first sights the infamous whale. Ahab then quite theatrically nails this doubloon to the main mast, and here they are, a perfectly ordered hierarchical society gathered underneath a massive wooden cross, and what do they nail to that cross but the spoils of a blasphemous oath? Starbuck says as much. "Vengeance on a dumb brute," cried Starbuck, "that simply smote thee from blindest instinct? Madness! To be enraged with a dumb thing, Captain Ahab, seems blasphemous." This sets Ahab off on another epic soliloquy that defines their entire ill-formed quest. "All visible objects, man, are but as pasteboard masks. But in each event, in the living act, the undoubted deed, there, some unknown but still reasoning thing puts forth the mouldings of its features from behind the unreasoning mask. If man will strike, strike through the mask. How can the prisoner reach outside except by thrusting through the wall? To me, the white whale is that wall, shoved near to me. Sometimes I think there's naught beyond, but 'tis enough. He tasks me, he heaps me. I see in him outrageous strength, with an inscrutable malice sinewing it. That inscrutable thing is chiefly what I hate, and be the white whale agent or be the white whale principal, I will wreak that hate upon him. Talk not to me of blasphemy, man. I'd strike the sun if it insulted me. For could the sun do that, then could I do the other, since there is ever a sort of fair play herein, jealousy presiding over all creations. But not my master, man, is even that fair play. Who's over me? And here we arrive at Ahab's fatal flaw, the same as every hero of every Greek myth, Ahab's hubris. Who's over me isn't a question but a statement that no one is. It speaks to that unwillingness to recognize reality which I mentioned earlier. Ahab will not recognize his place in nature. He, instead, vows to strike out at it willfully. This is a transgression of cosmological proportions, and if there's one thing we can always count on in a story, every transgression gets punished, and the bigger the transgression, the bigger the punishment. All the chips are on the table here, and from that moment on, the Pequod is doomed. The cross here, the very main mast of the ship, mind you, is symbolic of the very center of civilization in the Western world. Medieval cities planned their entire layout around their cross-shaped cathedrals, whose center vault rose directly over the altar, the heart of the church. And this fraternal whaling society, the Puritan, rigidly Christian whaling ship, represents a strict, ordered society, pulled onward by their very cross, helmed by a madman. That's what this story is about. It's about what happens when the hierarchy goes wrong. It's one of the most compelling stories we have in all of literature, from Hamlet to the Iliad to Game of Thrones. What do we do when the king is corrupt, tyrannical, or mad? That's the meaning in Moby Dick. And the way Ishmael tells this well-known tale is what makes it unique. He highlights the perspectives of all the men as they slowly come to realize there's something off about this voyage. He offers the perspectives of the very different officers, some solemn and stoic, others jocular and carefree. He shows the reaction of the truly diverse and multicultural crew who all need to pull in the same direction, compelled by the same goals. We all recognize this story because it's real and meaningful. It poses and poses and poses the question, what do you do when the hierarchy goes wrong? It's a chronicle of the moment your boss's boss foolishly begins to run your company into the ground, through arrogance, through incompetence, or through ignorance or malice, or some combination of all these things. What should you say or do? When do you jump ship? That it's all over a whale in Moby Dick is a doubly poetic stroke, a call for a condor's quill from a witty genius with a sly sense of humor and a youth spent on whaling ships. This kind of meaning makes for the stuff of literary immortality. But fiction doesn't have to be that way. We can't all be immortals, that's for sure. Sometimes our tales aren't quite writ that large. What then? Well, frankly, symbolism, epiphanies, and overarching themes are tools that can be more easily abused than used. So unless you're reaching for a condor's quill yourself, best to wield these forces with due care. Even if you aren't consciously aware of your story's theme, rest assured that readers, pattern-recognizing animals that they are, will find some way to read one or more into your story for you. And to make up for being a little harsh on Professor King in the last section, I'll give him a lot of credit here for approaching this topic with the most sensible viewpoint I've encountered on the matter. He states, "Symbolism exists to adorn and enrich, not to create a sense of artificial profundity." I think that, when you read your manuscript over, you'll see if symbolism or the potential for it exists. If it doesn't, leave well enough alone. If it does, however, go for it. Enhance it. You're a monkey if you don't. The same things are true of theme. Writing and literature classes can be annoyingly preoccupied with theme, approaching it as the most sacred of sacred cows. But it's really no big deal. Once your basic story is on paper, you need to think about what it means to enrich your following drafts with your conclusions. To do less is to rob your work of the vision that makes each tale you write uniquely your own. Perhaps Melville sat down with all the symbolism that the whale entails in his mind, but I'm not sure he fully grasped the symbolic importance of the cross and the hierarchy. He wrote from experience, having survived a stint on a cannibal-filled island after fleeing a tyrant of a whaling ship captain himself. I'm not sure Melville understood he was tapping so deeply into the roots of human society when he conjured Ahab from who knows where. But as the story goes, he revised the novel a few times, each time magnifying the scope of Ahab's vendetta against Moby Dick at the behest of his friend Nathaniel Hawthorne, no small literary figure himself. But it must have occurred to Melville at some point to enlarge the scope of the human story, to emphasize the hubris of Ahab taking on such a force of nature. All that started with a simple whaling journey born out of his own seafaring experience. I think Stephen King is largely correct here. Tell a story first. Make it a human story with important magnetic plot elements, and significant symbols are likely to present themselves, perhaps even with obvious places to sharpen them on revision. What exactly did Melville know? It's a complicated question that brings us all the way back to the beginning of these lessons. To credit Melville's conscious mind with direct intention when he created a work with multiple deep symbolic meanings would be to ascribe to him near omniscience. Absurd. Yet to say that he didn't know much about what he was writing is to take away the genius that is rightly his on so many levels. This is the issue we began with. When an author makes 10 million decisions in the course of writing a novel, what does he really know about those decisions? No matter how technical we get into the theory of writing fiction, writing will still be a largely intuitive art. Literary writer Robert Boswell calls this phenomenon the half-known world. It's a bit like the difference between a flat and a round character. The round contains just enough facets to convince the reader of their reality. They seem like people with depth enough that there will always be something mysterious left in them. This holds true for literary fiction in a larger sense, that the story world is ordered enough to be familiar and chaotic enough to be interesting. Still further, the writer, to my mind, no matter how well they hone their craft, will only ever half know what they're doing when they create a new fiction. The rest bubbles up from beneath the surface, defying clear articulation. And that's likely where meaning lies, just out of reach of reason. Metaphors writ large, symbols, epiphanies, and themes, are such a feature of written fiction because great literary fiction should be operating in a territory that is ineffable or unexplained, a place where we don't already have words for the feelings and emotions that arise from such circumstances. Fiction is an exploratory art, and thus we find ourselves dealing with novel surroundings and circumstances. And often, we need help from the world we know to make sense of the new world we've just encountered for the first time. Enter the metaphor, writ large. Enter meaning. I'm writing this from the 16th floor of the Ellison Building in Massachusetts General Hospital. I'm in the lounge, the southern wall of which is entirely glass, overlooking Beacon Hill and the financial district in Boston. It is a shining spring day with blue skies and puffy clouds. The tall, glass and stone facades of the skyscrapers in the financial district tower over Old Beacon Hill, a neighborhood of brick townhouses that run up along a gentle slope all the way to the gold-domed State House that juts out at the top of the hill, glistening. Behind it, the Boston Common and public gardens are starting to come into the fullness of a green spring, flowers and leaves opening in the warm sun after a long winter. All of the streets below me are old and well-traveled. Paul Revere, Henry Adams, and John Kennedy walked these streets. I walk them now. The 16th floor is a cancer ward. I'm taking a break from a visit with my younger brother, who is down the hall being treated for a severe an excruciatingly painful stage 4 bone cancer that is likely to be fatal. I work with words. I am a master of them, and I find myself quite understandably inarticulate. Sucks is the word that keeps coming up whenever I talk to my extended family and friends who want to know how he's doing. How else does one describe a young man in his prime, degenerating into unspeakable pain and complete debilitation in the span of a handful of months? How do you describe how his wife is doing as she watches the love of her life, her best friend, slowly, seemingly helplessly dying? Friends, we still don't have words for this. What is the meaning there? I could give you an answer. Several, if you like. If I were religious, I could tell you about God's will, the journey we all must walk, and the suffering we must bear, the cross we must carry if you're a Christian. Would you like an answer from philosophy? Western or Eastern? I could give you a scientific answer to the reason we all must suffer and die. It's called senescence. Look it up if you don't know. It's a damn useful thing to know. Why did my brother get bone cancer at 35? Genetics is the answer the doctors gave him, though there are likely some unknown and unknowable environmental factors that triggered healthy bone cells to rapidly divide out of control when they did. Statistically, it has to happen to somebody, and my brother's number came up. These are all answers that ring true. These answers hardly scratch the surface, though. The GRE word for that is specious. I don't know what it's like to have bone cancer eat away at my spine. I know it's painful because of the way my brother reacts, but I also know from this that I don't really know what pain is. Not this pain. Not even close. I hope I never do. I don't think I could take it. It's a perfect spring day outside this window. The Bruins are in the finals. The birds are singing, and the weather is finally warm. If my brother is still with us next year, it'll be another small miracle for the oncologist here at MGH. What is meaning? Now that I've written what I've written here, half known is far too generous a characterization of what we know. Maybe fiction can tell us something about the things we don't know. Maybe it can explain why my sister-in-law is always on the edge of breaking down while I just feel numb. If I couldn't feel the tension in my neck, I wouldn't feel the slightest bit of difference from an ordinary day, except for the rare moments I feel it in my gut. He feels it always in his bones. And what to God does that mean to him? I haven't the foggiest idea, and likely neither does he. Write what you know, they say. It's laughable, utterly laughable. We know so little that's worth writing about. Great fiction comes from places we cannot touch and only faintly comprehend. With a great deal of luck and effort, we may acquire the skills required to make the things we don't know known to others, so that they may share in our experience and hard-earned wisdom, if we have any. You could try and do that. That would be meaningful. And so much for Subtext.
Never scripted scene. And we
The writing process. Ugh. As you may have guessed from the lesson title, I'm not super enthusiastic about talking process. I think this is a lingering frustration from grad school. If you've ever been to a reading, especially one where there are likely to be more than a handful of writers in the room, the question is as inevitable as cops and donuts, turkey on Thanksgiving, or lying in politics. Somebody's going to get up to the microphone, this works better with the microphone, and they're going to ask in a breathy tone, Could you just talk a little about your process? Yes, I mock a little here, and hell, they deserve it. It always struck me as the thing people would ask when they didn't have anything of substance to ask an author. And the haughty answers, dear God. This question always seemed to falsely inflate an ego so profoundly that the answers would come down as if from on high. The microphone would get louder with lots of reverb. A translucent, great, and powerful Oz's head would begin to say almost nothing meaningful. I was always hopeful during that split second between the questions asking and the response that the author would be granted a moment of divine comedic inspiration and decided to elaborately and mercilessly troll the shit out of the audience. Something like, well, first, I fill my beer helmet with 2 bottles of chocolate milk laced with crystal meth. Then I strip butt-ass naked, put on my Donald Duck slippers, throw on a 10-hour loop of ragtime piano, played at 1.5 speed, exactly 64 decibels, and then I just let her rip. Sadly, that never happened. I think my other frustration with this question was that it almost never yielded anything useful. Most writers who aren't rank beginners have already learned what works for them. If I find out that some Pulitzer Prize winner listens to humpback whale sounds in the background as she writes, what do you think the odds are that you'll ever walk in on row hunched over a keyboard in a dimly lit room with a bunch of bleating sea cows mewing in the background? Exactly 0, you guessed it. Authors are individuals with their own preferences and idiosyncrasies. Some really good writers write their first draft with a pen and a paper still. Most work on a computer, somewhere out there. And let's be fair, it's probably Brooklyn. There's a hipster who lugs an old-fashioned typewriter out to his Brooklyn coffee house to make a spectacle of himself as he hammers out his latest pretentious short story. The main point here is that if you're a beginner, you'll have to try a few things until you find a process that works best for you. If you're not a beginner, then you already know your process. If that process involves whale sounds, you're a weirdo. So what? Keep writing nonetheless. For the beginners, though, what usually works is some form of a quiet place with as few distractions as possible. Usually, light instrumental music or no music is preferable. The phone should probably be elsewhere. And you probably want a comfortable chair. These are such basic things that I kind of feel ridiculous saying them. But the key is to find a way to get work done however you can get it done. I've met writers who set an alarm and get up 3 hours early to write in the quiet of the morning. I know night owls too. Do what works for you. We've discussed the abstract tools of the trade and the lessons in this series. However, there are a few concrete tools that you should have on hand as well, especially if you're a relatively new writer. I recommend having internet access handy. There are so many little questions that come up in the course of writing a piece of fiction that you'll never anticipate beforehand. If I'm setting a story in a real city, for instance, I always like to use street names and landmarks that offer a sense of the place, especially if it's an iconic place. I wrote a short story set in New Orleans recently, and using Google Maps to digitally walk the route my character walks was invaluable. It saved me a ton of revision time by ensuring I had my logistics correct. And Wikipedia is insanely useful when little questions come up. You just have to be disciplined with the internet while you're writing. It's not the time for cat videos. Additionally, you should always have access to a thesaurus. It's a huge time saver and a vocabulary builder all in one. Consistent use of a thesaurus will make your diction and your writing mind sharper. For the same reason, it also pays to have a grammar guide nearby if you have a question. This next one also seems a bit obvious to say to an aspiring creative writer, but you need to have an active imagination. You might not be able to help yourself in this regard already. Given that you have interest in writing fiction, odds are good that you already drift into a daydream at the drop of a hat. If you don't, consider this your license to start. Play games with the strangers you encounter. Imagine their lives and homes. What do they do for a living, etc. Beyond this, it's useful to practice empathy. And when I say this, I don't mean that you should empathize in the common way most people think of it, to feel for the other person as a synonym for pity. People don't want or need your pity. Empathizing in this sense is about seeing the world from a different perspective and legitimately trying to understand it. A lot of that means making an effort to understand what's motivating people, asking why they're acting the way they are, and trying to figure out how they tick. I suspect this is becoming more of a lost art, especially as modern politics and culture descend into ideological tribalism. Humans aren't wired to empathize with the position of the other tribe, whatever that tribe may be. It will help a lot to spend time outside your tribe, listening, not judging, and giving other people the benefit of the doubt that they're acting sensibly according to their own personality, culture, and interests. Moral personality and evolutionary psychology are excellent tools for puzzling out the reasons people behave the way they do. But human beings are extraordinarily complex. A human brain is the most complicated thing in the universe. Perhaps this is one of the reasons readers implicitly and explicitly resent stereotypical characters. Flat, real-life stereotypes are rare, thankfully. If you begin with the understanding of your own ignorance, it makes understanding other people at least plausible, especially when dealing with people you don't like. I went to graduate school in a red state. Nearly all my colleagues were religiously blue in their ideological persuasion, and if there were any who weren't, they certainly didn't advertise that fact. I sometimes heard my younger colleagues complaining about the ignorance of their students, which, frankly, I found appalling. I wondered if any of these urban 20-somethings had any idea how much a cow weighed, or the foggiest idea of what it would be like to grow up in a town with fewer than 1,000 people. I learned a lot from my rural students, precisely because I didn't approach them with any preconceived notions of moral, political, or intellectual superiority. Judging other people isn't a novelist's job. Asking questions about them is. There are always a million things you don't know about other people. Start from a position that assumes you're the ignorant one, because you are. Then write. Rant complete. On the first draft, there's really only one prominent school of thought that I've encountered: get it done. There's a popular essay out there by Anne Lamott titled Shitty First Drafts, and it's almost as ubiquitous as Strunk and White in composition and creative writing classes these days. The gist of Lamott's essay is that one shouldn't fret too much over how good that first draft is, because you can just revise what you've written into a better draft later. The most important thing is just getting it done. She states, "The first draft is the child's draft, where you let it all pour out and then let it romp all over the place, knowing that no one is going to see it and that you can shape it later." Well, hogwash. I understand the sentiment if you're the type of person to let the pressure of trying to write something perfect keep you from writing anything at all. But instead of aiming for a shitty first draft, how about something passable, decent, or dare I even say it, good? Good musicians don't just record a bunch of dissonant noises and edit out the sounds that don't work. Nor do good painters slap swaths of formless colors onto their canvases to be pushed around and reshaped until the messy blobs of paint become something resembling an image. Artists work with intention. If your intention is to vomit a slew of words onto the page and revise them and revise them and revise them until there's something other than vomit, good luck to you. You'll be revising a long time. Why not try to at least adopt the position of an artist from the outset? Do yourself and your readers a favor and begin with intention. A good first draft stands a much better chance of becoming a great book than a shitty one ever will. This isn't to say that all your sentences should be beautiful and your plot fully formed from the get-go, but what Lamott proposes just bugs me. It sounds cowardly, frankly. An artist can no more be a coward than a soldier can if they want to live. Don't be afraid of what you're doing. Embrace it. Strive for Christ's sake. If you don't sit down with the idea that you'll be able to do something good, then you might as well not sit down in the first place. Yes, done is better than perfect, and yes, revision will make something bad mediocre, which you may be able to shape into something good with considerable effort. but try to write the best thing you can write every time you write. And do it with the understanding that future you is going to have to step in and edit that draft into something even better. That's how writing works, and you'll save future you a lot of work if you begin with intention instead of cowardice. Now there are two schools of thought on the first draft. Choose wisely. When you have a draft done, you'll need to do a lot of revision. How much revision depends on what you think needs to be done. Read what you've written, and be as honest as you can be about what you have. If large structural changes need to be made, well, get cracking. I've met very committed writers who finished their first draft and started over from scratch, sometimes multiple times. If that's what you think you need to do, don't delay. Get to work. Personally, I work a lot less intuitively than this. I think for a long time before I start writing the first word. I have a good sense for the big questions in the story, like narrative posture, major plot elements, who my characters are, etc. To do less, to my mind, is akin to trying to build a house without plans. Personally, I'd rather live in a house that someone drew up before they broke ground. But I'm not overly rigid if these plans don't materialize exactly as I'd envisioned. If in the process of writing a story, a plot event that I'd previously thought would work a certain way simply doesn't work, then I won't force the issue. In other words, I won't force a character to act against their nature simply because of a foreordained notion I had about how the plot should unfold. It wouldn't ring true. This is a place to be flexible and give the issue more thought. If things aren't quite ringing true when you read your draft, focus on those spots. Think long and hard about them, and revise. Do whatever you need to do to get that draft to work from start to finish in your eyes. Then, set it down. When you can revise your draft no further after the first pass, you need to forget it as much as you can. Think of this as a cooling off period. And you'll literally be forgetting as much about the story as you can. A month or two is probably a good amount of time. You'll never be able to read your own work with truly innocent eyes because the story did come from you and you were there for every second of its creation. But this cooling off period usually provides enough distance that you'll notice a lot more of the little wrinkles your counterpart in the past overlooked. When you've done everything you can with this draft, read it in a finished form. I recommend some form of e-reader, whether it be a tablet application or an actual e-reader. Find a way to get your document onto a device that formats it like a book. Just when you think you've gotten all your little errors out of your document, you'll learn that you've missed a slew of things that your eyes just scanned right over. For some reason, mistakes pop out more readily from a book than from a computer screen. The closer you can get to book form, the better. I had a 6th printing edition of Truman Capote's In Cold Blood from 1966. And I marked 6 spelling, formatting, and punctuation mistakes that were edited out in later printings. This is just the nature of writing a document with 80,000 words. Even if you're a genius like Capote and 99.9% of those words are correct, that's still what? 80 mistakes? No human is perfect, but the better the tools you use to help you, the better you'll be at catching your imperfections when they arise. Eventually you're going to have to let someone read your work. Remember, writing is a social action, and your readers are the crucial component here. So when you can do no more on your own, give your manuscript to a person or two whose feedback you value. An important point in this part of the process is to learn to not be defensive about your work. This can be very difficult. The reader's experience with your story world is their experience. Listen and learn from it what you can. But also know that this is an individual experience. One of the most frustrating aspects of a workshop can be that the people reviewing your work may not be the audience you're hoping to reach. In my workshops, I had satirists, poets, people who wrote dark transgressive fiction, people who wrote very abstract fiction, horror writers, sci-fi wonks, and even several who wrote literary fiction exclusively. Often the feedback amounted to, "I don't like this," from one corner of the room, which would inevitably prompt a, "Really? I absolutely love that," from the other corner of the room. Then what? The bottom line is that you're going to have to try and get feedback from readers in your target audience. Or, failing that, you could hope to rely on a discerning editor with an eye toward what your intended audience likes. Ultimately, the market will decide exactly what your work is. Until then, you'll only have a vague idea of what you'd like it to be. You're writing a simulation for readers to process. Until they process your work, it's only half complete. Over the years, I've had a few folks, some of them other writers, who've approached me and asked where I get my ideas from. The answer is different for different stories. I suppose the answer is similar to where a great invention comes from. Someone sees a need and then produces something to fill that need. I see a story that should come to life, maybe starting with a character, a scene, or a situation. Art, in almost every form, has a way of presenting the seed of a story idea. So I consume art in many different forms voraciously. Books, films, music, photography, paintings, etc. But I also spend a lot of time reading about the world, whether it's in nonfiction books or newspapers. Newspapers are often great sources for ideas about people. An example headline I showed to one of my classes reads, "Man eats underwear to beat breathalyzer." Real life truly is stranger than fiction, and I mean this. If I wrote that underwear headline into a story and presented it in a workshop, most of the people in the workshop would say they didn't buy it. That would never happen, they'd say. And yet, there is such a man out there, believe it or not. This is one of the tricky things about fiction. Flying monkeys are perfectly reasonable in some story worlds, but real-life things that you've witnessed often strike readers as being over-the-top ridiculous in a realistic story world. The bottom line is that it's the writer's job to make those seemingly unbelievable things believable. You'd have to conjure the type of plausible desperation and faulty logic in a character that readers could see him somehow snipping off and furtively devouring his own underthings right at the moment the cop tapped on his window with the flashlight. "Sir, what the hell's that you're chewing on? Are them your damn tighty-whities? Good Lord." Additionally, I suggest traveling as much as you can and moving to places you know nothing about. Take a sojourn in a place where the culture is different to yours. On the life of the writer, I suggest a few things seriously. First, read a lot. When I was formulating my structural heuristic of plot, I read about 1,000 short stories in 6 months. I probably averaged 5 stories a day, which was about 100 stories every 20 days. Most days I read 8, others I read 4, but I always read with a focus, looking carefully for the inner workings of the plot, the way suspense was initially cued, the constraints and the resolutions. This helped me to understand plot both intuitively and explicitly, and it helped me to understand the aesthetic of the short story immensely. Read a lot, and read a lot of what you're looking to write. You won't become a better writer by reading alone, but you also won't get as good as you can be by just writing. You've got to read good writing too. I'm also going to mention something here that I haven't seen mentioned often in other books about writing. Writers are people, and they tend to be a particular type of people. They're usually introverts, and from this demographic, loneliness, depression, and suicide seem to be overrepresented compared to the general population. There's also a quasi-romanticized myth of the depressed or alcoholic writer, especially among literary writers. There are 2 quotes that I think sum up the mythos of the writer when considered together. The first from Nietzsche, the second from Hemingway. Nietzsche states, "He who fights with monsters should see to it that he himself does not become a monster, and when you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you." Nietzsche's talking about the type of monsters that haunt a lot of writers, both personal and philosophical. They could be depression, loneliness, or the massive metaphysical questions we deep-thinking writers tend to grapple with endlessly. A lot of writers have the type of personality that just can't stop staring at the damn abyss. And they can't seem to go on about their day the way most normal people seem to be doing effortlessly. That's merely an illusion if you didn't know already. The Hemingway quote is from his Nobel Prize speech, and it seemed to embrace the idea that some form of abyss gazing is part of the job. Writing, at its best, is a lonely life. Organizations for writers palliate the writer's loneliness, but I doubt if they ever improve his writing. He grows in public stature as he sheds his loneliness, and often his work deteriorates. For he does his work alone, and if he is a good enough writer, he must face eternity, or the lack of it, each day. It strikes me that Hemingway is talking about eternity in the same way Nietzsche talks about the abyss, as though somehow the writer must stare at the abyss, let it stare back into him, and if he doesn't, the writing will suffer. And can I say hogwash twice as emphatically as I did to Anne Lamott? I mean, you'd have to in order to drown out Hemingway. He's a sizable literary figure, don't you know? But I must return to one of my earliest premises, that writers don't fully understand what it is they're doing, even the Hemingways. Papa is correct, though, that writers do work alone, but only to an extent. Their ideas spring from the culture they're living in. They're writing for an audience. They have help from editors, colleagues, and friends. There isn't a single book out there that's the sole product of a single human being alone against the infinite. And worshipping this mythical artist against the abyss mentality can be legitimately harmful and even deadly if taken too far. I've lost colleagues and friends to suicide, and I don't know many writers who haven't. Depression is a serious business that affects all too many writers, and this mythos of the artist gives writers, who are already prone to pathological thinking by temperament, an excuse they don't need to wallow in their depression when they should be getting help for it instead. Don't mistake pathology for creativity. Depression will not help with productivity either. I am happiest at my keyboard. It's a lucky trait for a writer. But this isn't the case for everyone who writes. If you're spending too much time alone, take a break, get out, talk to someone. And if you're depressed to the point you can't manage it, get help. You don't need to be on the verge of destruction to create something beautiful. And if your brain is telling you this, that's your pathology talking, not your creativity. A tendency toward depression seems to be correlated with creative minds, but that doesn't mean it's causal. It probably just means that creative types need to keep a closer watch on their mental health than the average person. I have a couple suggestions on this front based on personal experience and psychological research. Even if, scratch that, especially if you're an obsessive writer, you need to remember that your brain is attached to a body. That body needs to be tended to if your brain is going to work to its highest potential. The best thing you can do for brain health is cardiovascular exercise. It doesn't have to be vigorous, and it doesn't even have to be daily, but you should get your heart rate up for 20 minutes or so at least a couple times a week. This is the most effective way to keep your mind sharp. Eat well, too. If you beat up your body and fill it with garbage food and chemical substances, it's unrealistic to expect your brain to be as productive as it could be. Don't fall for the mythos of the suffering writer. It's stupid. Don't turn yourself into a drunken degenerate either. It won't do a thing to make you a better artist, and it'll certainly make you a worse, lonelier, sadder person in the process. And if you're ever suicidal, talk to a professional. Walk into the ER. Don't wait. You can't write any sort of book if you're dead. You owe it to yourself, your family, your friends, and your community to stick around and share your talents with the rest of us. There are so many writers out there who left years, even decades on the table. We've lost many future masterpieces because their putative authors didn't get the help they needed when they needed it. Die at your keyboard when you're 97 instead, with a stack of great novels on the shelf behind you, all with your name on them. Writing is a process of creation. If you strive to create something beautiful, new, or meaningful, you've adopted a noble goal. Thanks for that. You could just as easily have decided to do something destructive. A lot of people do. Have fun creating new worlds and new people. I hope to read about them someday. If you truly love this process, you'll never be a quote-unquote failed writer, whatever that is. I hope my answer to the dreaded process question was slightly more useful to you than speed-laced chocolate milk. So here we are at the end, the real end, and I'd like to finish with a story that illustrates the vision I had in mind when I started composing these lessons. So here goes. Some time ago, in a modest city in the geographical center of what is now modern Germany, a boy was born to a family of musicians. This boy was the youngest of 8 children and was schooled by his father in violin and music theory. At 10, the boy's mother and father died, leaving him in the care of his older brother, also a musician. The boy continued to learn music earnestly, sneaking a peek at his brother's musical scores every chance he could get, despite being prohibited from touching the expensive paper on which the scores were written. He studied musical theory religiously, on his own and at school. He learned to play the organ so well that he was already a renowned organist as a teenager. You already know the boy's name. He's so famous you cannot even remember when you didn't know the name Johann Sebastian Bach. Did you know his name before or after you knew Neil Armstrong or Cleopatra's name? Bach wrote over 1,000 musical compositions of varying styles and lengths, designed for solo instruments, chamber groups, orchestras, and choirs. His output was so prolific it staggers the mind of the most productive musicians and composers alive to play his music today. Bach's music is ornate, intricately beautiful, and richly complex, and he created all this beautiful music despite a deep, profound, and thorough understanding of musical theory. Wait, what? Yes, that's right, Bach knew musical theory. Well, duh, Ro, of course he knew musical theory. One might even make the case that Bach wouldn't have been the musician he was without his formal training in musical theory. Yes, of course. So what am I getting at? I'm getting at the obstinate insistence of many writers and teachers of writing that the intuitive way of teaching and learning writing is the only way to do things. That thinking about our art the same way composers, painters, filmmakers, ballet dancers, and jazz trombonists all approach their craft has nothing useful to say about the way great writers do business. Writing is about winging it, you see? Except I don't. And I never understood how this school of thought has come to dominate such a well-established art form without a serious threat to it from a well-formed, comprehensive, skills-based theory of fiction writing, especially with the proclivity of so many writers to write specifically about the art of writing. Part of the answer surely lies in the complexity of the subject. As I mentioned at the outset, writing a novel might be the most cognitively complex artistic endeavor a person can undertake. There are myriad skills that must be put into play in a complementary manner so that the text works on all of these levels simultaneously. Yet, I hope I've demonstrated throughout these lessons that each of these aspects of fiction are skills that can be learned and mastered, and not only can be, but should be if the writer has any intention of writing well. To shirk the task of learning them all, to my mind, is the same as a musician deciding that, hey, you know what? I just don't want to mess with the minor keys, man. They can be such a bummer. My hope in composing mechanics was that this might be at least a good starting point for a comprehensive theory of fiction writing. Here are your tools. Here's how you use them. Now refine. I don't think for a second that going through this series once will suddenly make a master of you, but I know it won't hurt, despite what the folks deeply ideologically and financially invested in the intuitive school of thought will likely say. I also don't present these lessons with the thought that you'll be sitting at your keyboard thinking about 92 different theoretical considerations as you're writing a story. That wouldn't be much help. Quite the contrary. But mastering at least the understanding of, if not the application of the skills presented here, complemented in the skill-building exercises in this volume's companion, I hope will put the tools you need in your toolbox for the moment you're sitting at your keyboard and your story needs that exact technique. Bach probably wasn't thinking in terms of a circle of fifths when he was composing, at least probably not the way it might get taught in a music class. I'm guessing he just heard music, and it came to him well-formed because he developed an innate understanding of musical form, the likes of which few humans ever have. That's about what my intention is here. To define the realm of narrative from A to Z in such a way that the writer who has all these skills can allow the story to come to them well-formed in a manner of speaking. Before I attended graduate school, I'd already written 5 novels. From my very first story, I'd begun refining my craft. I was strongly of the opinion that if one wanted to be great at something, they had to work hard at it. To that end, when I wasn't writing, I was reading about writing, thinking about it, and practicing. One of the reasons I sought out graduate school was that I'd read half a forest's worth of craft books. Some were fair, some decent, some good enough. Many others were slightly more than useless. But even after all that reading, what I didn't feel like was that I had a comprehensive understanding about what fiction writing was. I didn't have a theory in the way musical composers have musical theory. In graduate school, I learned narrative theory comprehensively with the help of my mentor, Aaron James. In this series, I'm presenting the set of lessons the pre-graduate school Roe would have killed to get hold of. Each of the story elements here, whether it be the three-part structure of plot, the characteristics of a character narrator, or the syntactic structure of a right-branching sentence, are all presented with far more brevity than I know them. I had to work to acquire the understanding of these story elements by reading scores of volumes that elucidate the parts of each in greater detail. Without my time in graduate school, I wouldn't have known where to look to learn many of the lessons I've presented here, or even that I needed to learn these things at all. At times, when I was reading and revising these lessons, I found them to be far too brief to present what I would consider a deep understanding of each concept. Yet here we are at 140,000 words. My hope is that this series has been enough to provide you with the broad theoretical foundation I had to piece together from hundreds of books, from craft guides to tomes on narrative theory to textbooks on human psychology. I suppose that's a useful intent to have in creating such a series of lessons, that it serves as a foundation for books on writing yet to be written. I'd love it if it serves that purpose for you as well, as a foundation for deeper understanding of your craft, and more importantly, as a platform for greater creations to rise forth from. Here's hoping. Lastly, for those of you who would like to pursue deeper knowledge on each of these specific topics, I'd urge you to seek out the source material cited in the video versions. And if you'd like a few suggestions on how to probe these fields of knowledge more generally without committing to 2+ years of graduate school, a categorized list of suggested reading is forthcoming. Have fun writing. Enjoy your journey and evolution as a writer, and feel free to visit me anytime at rowlit.com, where I'll be writing about writing and composing my own fiction. Until then, suggestions for further reading. Craft. Stephen King on Writing, a Memoir of the Craft. E.M. Forster, Aspects of the Novel. John Gardner, The Art of Fiction, Notes on Craft for Young Writers. Barry Tarshish, How to Write Like a Pro. Each of these 4 books is very different and useful in its own ways. At times, they all offer contrasting information and approaches to the tack taken in this series of lessons. Had I found that contrasting information useful, I'd have included it. What I did find essential, I referenced in the appropriate lessons. You will find many overlapping ideas from mechanics in these 4 titles. King writes mostly from personal experience and seemingly his intuitive understanding of how to get the job done. For the most part, he's usually right. Forster's lectures are also largely intuitive, yet it's hard to ignore the insights of such a gigantic literary figure. A quick and useful read. Gardner tends to vacillate between the concrete and the metaphorical realms, and like most craft guides, I find myself disagreeing with the information presented about as often as I agree. But when Gardner hits the mark, he nails it. Tarshish's book, much discussed in my section on the text, is actually a guide to writing commercial nonfiction, but his incremental approach is so no-nonsense and useful that I can't help but recommend it to all writers. It may be out of print, but it can and should still be had. His emphasis on clarity and the reader's focus is something every writer should read and heed. Narrative. Seymour Chapman, Story and Discourse, Narrative Structure in Fiction and Film. Mary Lore Ryan, Narrative as Virtual Reality, Immersion and Interactivity in Literature and Electronic Media. Also by Mary Laura Ryan, Possible Worlds, Artificial Intelligence and Narrative Theory. David Herman, Story Logic, Problems and Possibilities of Narrative. And Gerard Genette, Narrative Discourse, an Essay in Method. Let's face it takes a special type of literary geek to geek out to narrative theory. If you're intrigued enough by mechanics to think that you might be one of those special people, allow me to try to scare you off one last time by stating that most narrative texts are dry, not particularly well written, and probably could be considered a kind of torture by various humanitarian organizations worldwide. However, if you're still insistent that you'd like to learn more, I've ordered this list as best I could to get a beginner properly oriented as painlessly as possible. Chapman's book is both readable and covers the basics as broadly and as clearly as any text written since. Mary Laura Ryan's two greatest works are among the best books ever written on plot, specifically, but also narrative in general. Possible Worlds is more technical than narrative as virtual reality, so I think it might be better to read the latter first, as adopting to the vocabulary and mindset of a narrative theorist is probably best done the way French chefs boil frogs. If you get through Possible Worlds and are still intrigued, you might be ready for the hard stuff. David Herman is a wonderful scholar, and Story Logic is probably the best of the cognitive titles in the world of narrative theory, but Herman does not read easy. This is no beach book, and so too with Genette. But Narrative Discourse is probably the most foundational book ever written in the field. It is a slog, and a confusing slog at times. If you make it through this, though, congratulations on becoming one of the initiated, geek. Syntax and Sentences. Steven Pinker, The Sense of Style, The Thinking Person's Guide to Writing in the 21st Century. Lynn Truss, Eat Shoots and Leaves, The Zero-Tolerance Approach to Punctuation. Brooks Landon, Building Great Sentences. Virginia Tufte, Artful Sentences, Syntax as Style. Of all the sections in mechanics, I feel like the lessons on the text are the place where I had to omit reams of useful material for the sake of not writing 3-hour lectures. I tried to balance the construction of a solid, comprehensive, systematic approach to sentence writing against the patience of an audience I suspect will be much more interested in the other 5 sections of these lessons. But I can't stress enough that the text is where the class of a writer is immediately apparent or apparently lacking. Part of what made me comfortable leaving out material here was the existence of such great writing and lecturing on the subject elsewhere. Each of the 4 titles mentioned here will deepen any writer's knowledge base when it comes to different aspects of the text. Pinker's approach to grammar and style is extremely comprehensive, approachable, and is based in the best current knowledge we have about how language and the mind work. Truss's best-selling book on punctuation, yes, you heard that correctly, is so damn funny that it makes reading about punctuation downright pleasurable, at least for a book nerd. I also can't say enough about Brooks Landon's lecture series on sentence writing. My only caveat is that one may walk away with Landon's bias towards loose modifiers as the end-all be-all in sentence construction, which is why I've included Tufte's review of the whole scope of sentence greatness. It's not a work you can absorb in an afternoon, but in doses, Artful Sentences is top class. All 4 of these titles should be compulsory for every serious writer. Linguistics. Steven Pinker, The Language Instinct, How the Mind Creates Language. John McWhorter, The Power of Babel, A Natural History of Language. Also John McWhorter. Our Magnificent Bastard Tongue, The Untold History of English. Mechanics didn't go nearly as deep into the linguistics weed as I could have done in several places. Many writers tend to be fascinated with language, but I've come across my fair share of our kind who might roll their eyes at the suggestion they should read a book about linguistics. So I'll leave the deep dive type stuff to the experts, with whom the subject matter properly belongs. Both McWhorter and Pinker qualify as experts, and as an added bonus, they both possess that rare gift of making what could be difficult and dry material both accessible and interesting. The Language Instinct is still the best foundational book on linguistics outside of a textbook, and the 2 McWhorter titles I'm including on this list track the history of language in general and the history of English. All 3 suffice to give a layperson an excellent baseline understanding of a very complex field. Psychology and Human Nature. Keith Oatley, Such Stuff as Dreams, The Psychology of Fiction. Steven Pinker, The Stuff of Thought, Language as a Window into Human Nature. Jonathan Haidt, The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. Robert Sapolsky, Behave, The Biology of Humans at Our Best and Worst. I'm sure you won't be too shocked to hear that I'm fascinated by the human mind. That's part of why I started writing fiction, as a vehicle for exploring the human condition and our great diversity of cultures and environments. But I think you need a bit more ammunition going into such territory than your gut instincts if you're going to be any good at exploring human nature. Great novelists of the past were deeply steeped in multitudes of philosophical traditions, and none of that material would do much to hold a writer back, by my reckoning. Yet I can't help but think that writers like Tolstoy or Hawthorne, or especially Emily Dickinson, would have given their left arm for a peek into the 4 books I've included here. Oatley, in addition to being a capable novelist himself, is the world's leading expert in the psychology of written fiction. Such Stuff as Dreams offers an insightful tour into the reasons people read and write fiction, no small matter to the serious writer. The other 3 titles are here to offer a window into human nature more generally. The Stuff of Thought explores how language interacts with and reveals the inner workings of our psychology, all presented in a way only Pinker can offer. I've drawn from it directly in several places in Mechanics. Haidt's groundbreaking book, Into the Nature of Moral Psychology, is so understated in its tone and is so accessible that one might make the mistake of forgetting they're reading a work so foundational that people will still be learning from it for decades to come. Moral foundations are often the framework for human behavior, and understanding these foundations may fundamentally change the way you think about character motivation. And if you're ever tempted to think that human behavior is a simple matter, Robert Sapolsky will disabuse you of that notion thoroughly, and in the process he'll leave you with a sense of wonder at the depth of complexity in both our physical world and in the mind that perceives and acts in it. Each of the titles listed here is as much a doorway to a deeper world to be further explored as it is a link back to this series of lessons on the mechanics of fiction writing. Sound these depths and your writing and thinking will be sharper for it. Never stop exploring, never stop improving.